Welcome to Nazarene, Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. And in this part 18 of Revelation Simplified, we want to talk about the new heaven and the new earth. So this brings us to the end of the Revelation timeline. What we've seen is significant trauma, significant destruction, all throughout the seals with the horse forces marshaling the armies of the world to their end-time positions, and then the giant climactic end-time battles that take place during the tribulation or the trumpets, the 7 cups or bowls of wrath, and then the battle of Armageddon. But then we see a 1,000-year millennium, the end of which we'll see a second war of Gog and Magog, and the earth continues on a little while. We don't know exactly how long until we come to Yeshua's fourth and final coming and the white throne judgment. And Yeshua speaks of this in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 35, where he says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the messengers of heaven, but my Father only." So we don't know exactly how long the earth is going to continue on after the second war of Gog and Magog until it's burned up. But this is what will take place, and this is what 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10 speaks of, when Kepha, or Peter, tells us that the day of Yahweh, meaning Yeshua, will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat, and both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up at the brightness of his coming. And when the earth is burned up, this is when it will also come to pass, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting in verse 51, where the apostle Shaul, or Paul, tells us, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed." We will not all sleep because while most people will be sleeping in the dust, there are some that will still be alive in Yeshua. But yet nonetheless, we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible at Yeshua's fourth and final coming. And when the earth is burned up, we shall all be changed. So from this point forward, there is no more earth to dwell in. So this is when we go to the great white throne judgment, as it says in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 11. It says, "Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them." So just that language, that there was found no place for the heaven and the earth, that seems to indicate that we're not going to the same kind of a physical reality in the future, that things are going to necessarily change. So, but we go to the judgment, and in verse 12 it says, "And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before Elohim, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, by the things which were written in the books." And we'll talk more about this in the Torah government study. But again, it's not enough just to believe. It's not enough just to educate ourselves and know who Yeshua is. We have to have works to be written in the book of life. So we'll talk more about that in the Torah government study. But in verse 15, it says, "And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire." So there are essentially two results, two end-time events, two ways we can go after the first death. Now, the first death, that's when our body sleeps in the dust or physically decays, turns into dust, so the physical body is dead. That's leaving only the spiritual body. Now, the second death, going to the lake of fire, all that has to happen there is that Yahweh or Yeshua doesn't choose us. He doesn't take us. That's all that has to happen. So if we don't distinguish ourselves through our works, now again, salvation is by grace through faith, or favor through faith, and even that not of our own doing. But our reward is according to our works. Now those who are taken, then they go to the throne room in heaven, because many are called, few are chosen. So the few who are chosen go to the throne room in heaven. And so far we've seen a number of groups in the throne room in heaven. We've seen the great multitude dressed in white who come out of the great distress, of the great tribulation. We've seen the 144,000 singing a new song before the throne, and we know that they're redeemed from the earth. We've also seen the 2 witnesses who are called to go up where we assume it's the throne room in heaven. We don't know, we're not told that, but that's where everyone else goes. Then there's the 24 elders who cast their crowns before the throne, and 12 of those are Yeshua's apostles or disciples, we assume including Shaul. We don't know who the other 12 are. And then we know that everyone goes to stand before the great white throne on the judgment, and that is in the throne room in heaven. And after this, we believe that this is sort of that Yahweh then empties the throne room out, so to speak, in that those of us who are selected then go on to the new earth, which it speaks of in Revelation chapter 21 and verse 1. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea. So this is the same language that Isaiah speaks of in Isaiah chapter 65 in verse 17, where he says, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered or come to mind." Now, sort of as a side note, sometimes people ask, I get questions, is this a new earth or is it a renewed earth? And a lot of people know that in Hebrew, the word for new actually means renewed. So the word in Hebrew is chadash. It's Strong's Old Testament 23:18. It's a primitive root meaning to be new, but not in the sense of being completely brand new, like you take the plastic wrap off of it. It's more in the sense of being renewed or rebuilt or repaired or refreshed, so to speak. So sometimes people want to know, is this possibly a refreshed earth that we go to? And I can't say categorically no, but later we will see that there's a number of indications in the passage that it doesn't look like the same earth. It looks like we're going to sort of a different metaphysical plane or a different spiritual plane, a different metaphysical reality, so to speak. But then they come back and they say, well, in Genesis 1 and verse 2, there's such a thing as the ancient earth theory. And the theory goes that this is before the countings of the genealogies that gives us the count of 6,000 and some year age of earth. It says, but the earth was made formless and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. Now, in Hebrew, this phrase, made formless and void, that's the Hebrew tohu vavohu. And I had someone explain it to me one time. It says it's similar to what you get like with a tossed green salad. So sort of renewed or refreshed, so to speak. And they say, can that apply to the new earth? And we can't say no categorically, but later we're going to see in chapter 22, we're going to see several indications that it's going to be a different kind of existence altogether. So continuing in verse 2. It says, then I, Yochanan, saw the set-apart city, renewed Jerusalem, coming down from out of heaven, from Elohim, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And then it goes on to say in verse 3, it says, and I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of Elohim is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. Elohim himself will be with them, and will be their Elohim. So for those of you who are not part of the Hebrew roots movement or the original first century faith movement, we explain in the Torah calendar that in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, the apostle Shaul or Paul tells us that the original Israelite festivals are prophetic shadow pictures of things that are still to come. And so that's one of the reasons why we keep the Feast of Tabernacles every fall, is as a prophetic shadow picture of the time when we will dwell with Elohim and Elohim will pitch his tabernacle with us. And that's going to be a wonderful time as it continues in Revelation 21 and verse 4. It says, and Elohim will wipe away every tear from their eyes. We've been through some significant suffering and trauma at this point. He says, there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying, There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. So again, he's speaking about a different kind of reality now. And this parallels in Isaiah chapter 65, starting in verse 18, where he says, "But be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem as a rejoicing, and her people a joy. I will rejoice in Jerusalem, and joy in my people. The voice of weeping shall no longer be heard in her, nor the voice of crying." So he's comforting us after we've been through all of this trauma of the timeline. It's even going to be so much of a better reality. In verse 20, he continues, "No more shall an infant from there live but a few days." So no more sudden infant death, "nor an old man who has not fulfilled his days. For the child shall die 100 years old, but the sinner, being 100 years old, shall be accursed." So we don't know exactly what this world is going to look like, but we do know the reality of it is going to be different than the one we're presently experiencing. And as he says in verse 5, he says, "Then he who sat on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, Write, for these words are true and faithful." In verse 6, he said to me, "It is done. I am the Aleph and the Tav," that's Yeshua, "the beginning and the end. And I will give of the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. He who overcomes," which is another name for Israel, "shall inherit all things, and I will be his Elohim, and he shall be my son." So in order to be counted as one of those who overcome, we have to abide in him, and he in us, and he in the Father, and the Father in him. And so this is the kind of thing. This has to be we have to live set-apart lives. He says in verse 8, he says, "But the cowardly, the unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." So again, in order to go to the second death, all that has to happen is that he declines to take us. He doesn't decide to choose us. That's all it takes. And if we exhibit any of those qualities, that means that we're not going to make it. And that's according to his definitions and his standards. So continuing in verse 9, he says, "Then one of the 7 messengers who had the 7 cups filled with the 7 last plagues came to me and talked with me, saying, Come, I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife. And he carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me the great city, the set-apart Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from Elohim, having the glory of Elohim. Her light was like a most precious stone, like a jasper stone, clear as crystal. Also she had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and 12 messengers at the gates, and names written on them, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. So I couldn't help, while reading this, just noticing the similarity to the fivefold ministry and the living temple made of living stones that we are supposed to build, where we have the apostles and the prophets serving as the foundation, with Yeshua as the chief cornerstone or the head of the corner, and then also with the pastors, teachers, and evangelists all working together as one body, one temple. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the Torah government study, but that's how we're supposed to be organized. So continuing in Revelation chapter 22, again, we get more indications that this is not a renewing of the same earth, but that this is going to be an entirely different experience. So Revelation 22 and verse 1 says, "And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of Elohim and of the Lamb. In the middle of its street, and on either side of the river, was the tree of life, which bore 12 fruits, each tree yielding its fruit every month," which is very different than what happens here on this earth. "The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations." I suppose banana trees might be an exception to policy for that. But notice in verse 5, he says, There shall be no night there. They need no lamp, nor light of the sun. For Yahweh Elohim gives them light, and they shall reign forever and ever. So, again, that's another indication that this is a different kind of an earth that we're going to that doesn't follow the same physical rules as our existing earth. But what we've seen at this point is we've seen the entire Revelation timeline. We've seen all the tribulation that we're going to be going through, the major portions of it. We've also seen the comforts and the blessings of the white throne judgment and the new earth for those of us who are doing our best to walk in his spirit and do the works that Yeshua asks us to do in the Great Commission. We're fairly certain on everything we've covered up to this point. And in future portions of this video series, what we'd like to talk about is some other information that has a strong bearing and impact on us today in the years and decades to come. We maybe are not quite certain on these. They're subject to further review, but very good, very important information anyway. So the further topics that we'd like to cover is why we should avoid the early ingathering and the New World Order being set up in the land of Israel. We'd also like to talk about Ezekiel 37 and the dry bones resurrection, and also the two trees or the two sticks or the two writing tablets of Ezekiel 37. We also want to talk about the likelihood or the possibility, perhaps, of a restored Ottoman Islamic caliphate. We also want to talk about why the United States of America is the land of Babylon, of Jeremiah chapters 50 and 51. And we'd also like to do a news analysis. And I know that for myself, I didn't take much of an interest in the news or in history until I understood the operation of the four horses in the daily news and also in the history books. And because of this, I've found history to be a fascinating subject, and I've never looked at the news the same way again. I'd like to share those things with you in the upcoming portions of this video series. So thank you for joining me. Please join us again for the next part of Revelation Simplified. Shalom.